So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you today, the Cammeraygal people, and to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. My name's Kelly Mitchell from the Historical Services team at Stanton Library, and I have the pleasure of introducing North Sydney Council's historian, Dr. Ian Hoskins, for the latest in our online History Talk series, The Art of Living, Flats and Apartment Buildings in North Sydney from 1908 to 1958. This is still a continuing series, so keep your eye on our website for further details of upcoming talks. And if you missed any of the previous talks, then recordings are available to watch online. They're uploaded via YouTube, but you can just search our website for History Talks to find the relevant links. If you have any questions during the talk, then feel free to write them into the chat box, and I'll put them to Ian for a short Q&A session after his presentation. But for any other general inquiries, requests for digital images and so on, then please email us at localhistory@northsydney.nsw.gov.au. And now I'll hand over to Ian for his presentation. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another history talk. And yeah, we're here to talk about flats, and flats in the first 50 years, because I can't fit, well, that's my favorite time for flats, and I can't fit any more in an hour. So if we were to do more recent flats, we'd have to book another hour. But these are the ones I find the most interesting and the loveliest, as you can probably, well, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, from that beautiful plan that I've got on the title page. One of the earliest architectural plans that we have in our collection, in fact, for some reason, the plans that were submitted with building applications through the 1910s and into the 20s were rarely retained by council. So we've got the paperwork, the other bits of paperwork, but we don't have the beautiful plans in most cases. I mean, we have literally just a handful of the many, many hundreds that were submitted. But this is an exception, and this one dates to 1928. The collection is very strong between 29 and 49. So this is one of the early ones. You see how lovely the colors, all of this was hand colored on the original. I'll talk a little bit about this building as we move on, and just some details. So interesting word, flat. It's one that we use in Australia and they use in the UK. Americans tend to use apartment, and I suspect that term is catching on in Australia too. Unit is the other expression just for the dwelling within a block of units, a block of flats, a block of apartments. And it made me go to our very huge Oxford English Dictionary of many volumes and look for the origins of the word. And there we have them, going all the way back to Beowulf, 1025, which is the floor or ground under one's feet, or a dwelling, house or hall. And then in its more contemporary use is a floor or story of a house, 1801, or a suite of rooms on one floor, 1824. And that's sort of what we use today. It's a confusing word, I suspect, if you're not used to it. So if you come from the States or not the UK, because talking about a flat building makes it sound like the building is very, very flat or has a flat roof, whereas blocks of flats tend to be quite the opposite. They're very tall. And that's a really beautiful example of a well, I've got a date of 1916 on that. I don't think I've quite nailed the build date, but that's as close as I could get. Sometimes using our archives is trickier than others, and I couldn't identify that one clearly, but close as I can, 1916. Beautifully restored, so all the bricks have been tuck pointed and it's looking like it was built just last year or something, but it's really quite an old one. And the other interesting point to think about in Sydney is that flats are a very economical use of space, and we're putting people up in the air. That's obvious. But their precursor in Sydney is the terrace house, which is quintessential style of Sydney architecture. And I'm using this photograph. It's one of my favorites. It appeared in Pix magazine in the 1950s when it was featuring Greenway, the big housing commission block, which I'll talk more about again, finished in 1954. 1953, as it was approaching its completion, they had this photograph, and they were juxtaposing the terraces in front, which I think are on McDougall Street, no, Broughton Street, in Kirribilli. And the point of the photograph was to show the slummy dwellings of the past and this wonderful new block of flats, which symbolizes the way we're living in the 1950s, and it does that very well. Although those terraces are still there, and I suspect they're worth several $1 million each now, restored with their smart kitchens and things. But the other useful thing about this photograph is that it shows you these two types of space efficient architecture: the terrace house, which efficiently uses space because it's sharing all those walls, and the apartment building, which puts everyone in the air, as I said. And it's probably worth bearing in mind the growth in North Sydney's population, understanding the fact that North Sydney was at the cutting edge of flat building development, approvals for flats in Sydney. Possibly you may associate early flats with the eastern suburbs and then down to Bondi and places, and that's true. So Potts Point, King's Cross, and then Bondi and the coastal areas close to the city have lots of lovely examples of 1920s and 30s blocks of flats. But North Sydney is right there up there with the first block of flats, which I'll show you a picture of shortly, in 1908. But you can see with the rapid growth in population that there's a need for flats, particularly flats close to the water in those early years, because people are typically working in the town or the city on the south side and going back and forth. And for reasons that I'm a little bit unclear about, the population peaks in 1947, so after the war, it's just over 60,000, and then starts dropping off. And I'm not entirely sure where they're going, because it coincides with the beginning of the post-war era of flat development. So the flats tend to be, the blocks of flats tend to be a little larger in the 1950s and get increasingly larger in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And I'm not quite sure why that should coincide with a drop in population from 1954. It's a little easier to explain through the 60s, as it's dropping again slightly because of the building of the expressway, which destroyed many, many hundreds of houses. So it took a whole chunk out of the heart of North Sydney, and all those people presumably moved on somewhere else. So many thousands left the area. But the population had begun to decline before that, while flats were being built. So if anyone has a possible answer to that, I'd be very interested to know. Now, and that photograph there, I took fairly recently. I was just driving around Kirribilli for another reason, and thought I'd take a few snaps for this upcoming talk. And there's the Venetian, and it's so nice. Kirribilli is really one of the best areas for looking at flats in North Sydney. And the Venetian was built in 1929. And when I was looking at the ads in the newspaper, it made a point of saying how there were electric hot water and possibly electric stove. Electricity was fairly new in North Sydney at that point. Had only really been a feature of power in housing for either stoves or electric hot water systems or lights from the mid-1920s. And it had been gas before that, and gas made from coal. So the great big North Shore Gas Company works on Neutral Bay, and then Oyster Cove would have been piping gas all through the streets of North Sydney prior to that, and did so for many years afterwards as well. But electricity was the new wonder power source, presumably coming from the coal-fired power stations in Pyrmont and White Bay. and that was described as Kirribilli's new palace. And I love the name too, the Venetian. Sydney was compared throughout the 20th century, possibly even as late as early as the late 19th century, to Venice, obviously because of the water, because of the waterway and the centrality of water transport for defining and understanding the city. So that would explain why this block of flats is called the Venetian. There was another one not far away around the corner in Neutral Bay in High Street, which the prospectus for which, contemporary with this, featured a gondola sort of being rowed up to the door. That was a block of flats designed by an architect called Stuart Mould. And it's not uncommon to see artists' impressions of the harbour and seeing a gondola on there. Kenneth Slessor referred to Sydney Harbour as a Vega kind of Venice as late as 1962, with all the ferries still chugging around. I took this photograph a little while ago on one of my walks, leading a walk through Neutral Bay, or preparing for it. And the point of it is to compare flats over, gee whiz, 1927 and 1955, that's 30 years, and look at the difference. These are essentially the same type of building, both 3-story. I'm not quite sure how many units in Bay Court on the right there. It may be 6, but it's 6 in Cot Cedar. And yet look at the difference in the design. One is just embellished so much with decoration, with the timber shingles, the bay windows, lots of decorative brickwork, borrowing from what I regard as an arts and crafts style. Anytime I see shingling, I'm thinking of arts and crafts. Certainly an older, what I refer to as historicist style of architecture. And that's interesting because flats are a new way of living, a modern way of living in the early 20th century, and yet for the first 20 or 30 years, they're drawing on current domestic architectural styles, which themselves are drawing on older styles, whether they be Georgian or English Revival. And so they're very established design motifs. And so you can almost have a block of flats that looks like a Tudor building, for instance, because of all the little elements there. It might have a half timbered gable. This one happens to have a shingle gable on the left. Whereas once we move into the post-war period, modernism is pretty well the only style in town, and modernism makes emphasizes the lack of decoration. It regards decoration as a decadent form of architecture, and so things should be produced with clean lines and produced efficiently. Makes a virtue. That's what I was trying to say. Makes a virtue of its lack of decoration. So you can see the difference between these two blocks, but both using brick, and there's possibly a bit of asbestos-filled fibre cement in the one on the right if they haven't taken it all out. But all that symmetrical, simple, efficient use of windows, not even aluminium windows at that point, probably timber windows unless they've been replaced. So really light rooms, great rooms on the block on the right, maybe an open plan living area, which certainly wouldn't be the case in the older block on the left. So it really just shows you how things changed in 30 years. Now, there was a great debate about living in flats in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in Australia. Some people thought flats were a terrible way of living, particularly for working class people. They weren't good for children, they were noisy, they promoted promiscuity. If anyone had to live in flats, it should be respectable middle class or upper middle class people, because you group a whole lot of working class people together and you're going to have trouble. That's literally how they were writing, town planners and architects and sociologists and whatever. Some of them. Others thought that flats were an effective way of allowing working people to live in a decent, newly built accommodation close to where they worked. And this is the Strickland building, which was completed in 1914. And it's a really beautiful building, beautifully designed, lots of design elements there. You might be able to see here a little keystone, wonderfully shaped, made of sandstone, inserted into the brick lintel. This took its cue from the very nearby Carlton United Brewery, or the old Tooth's Brewery, actually, just literally a stone's throw away on Broadway, where many of the people who lived in these flats may have worked. Several hundred people lived here after their really substandard and small terrace houses, which characterised Chippendale in the late 19th century, were demolished because they were just seen to be too awful. So having destroyed all those houses, they needed to put those people somewhere, and the city of Sydney really pioneered working class housing with Strickland building, and designed by their own city architect, whose surname was Broderick. Can't remember his first name. And yeah, so that's a really great example of a well-designed, beautiful block of flats. So there were criticism of blocks of flats, but there were some people who were willing to try that as a way of providing quality housing, as I said. But really the ideal for most people was for suburban living. And Strickland Flats was one government experiment, and Daceyville was another. Strickland was local government and Daceyville was state government. The Housing Board was established with the first Labor government in 1911 in New South Wales, and Daceyville was their prize project, a whole suburb laid out on garden suburb principles. So everyone got to have access to sunshine and fresh air and gardens and safe streets and beautiful houses. Fairly compact houses, but they were nicer houses than would have been found in many other places, and all rented, because it was the Housing Board, which was the precursor of the Housing Commission. So that's the other ideal, and what I think has come to be accepted as the Australian living ideal through the 20th century is the suburb, if you like, and not quite the quarter-acre block. That's a bit of a dream. Not that many suburbs in Sydney have quarter-acre blocks, but gardens out the back and the front. And those people who promoted suburbs like that, as I said, tended to look at flats as places where there was noise, and all sorts of bad things happened. I took the title of the talk, The Art of Living, from one of the articles that was in the newspaper. You can look up the newspapers and engage with the debate around 1910 to 1925 or thereabouts. And they referred to it as a very American way of living in flats, and the American art of living is how they expressed it. So I mentioned earlier the first block of flats, 1906, and that's that building there, which was originally called Beulah Flats, and is still there on the waterfront. Here it's called Hotel Braeburn, and in between it was called the Astoria, and it had a bit of a checkered history. It was opened as really luxurious flats for middle and upper middle class people, presumably some of them coming from the country needed somewhere to stay in the city, with dining rooms and kitchens and a bathing pool underneath, believe it or not, presumably using harbour water. Hopefully that was filtered. And I'm sure very well appointed rooms. And it was renamed the Astoria in the 1920s, and it fell on hard times. Run by a woman whose surname was McCormick, and there were she obviously had difficulties by the late 1920s. There was one instance in the paper where the two of the kitchen hands were throwing crockery out the window, and I'm not sure whether that's because they weren't getting paid or there was some other problem there, at the same time that some of the units were being raided for selling sly grog. So it had been an upper class establishment, maybe it still was, but there were other things happening. And then in 1931, when it had been renamed Hotel Braeburn, and still run by Mrs. McCormick, she couldn't pay her lease on the whole place. And because of the bankruptcy laws of the time, that had a potential for all the residents who had their own furniture in their rooms, despite the fact it was called a hotel, it was still essentially a block of flats. And they had the risk of losing all their belongings if she couldn't pay a lease. All those may have been taken by the bailiff, all the private possessions in the various rooms. So the newspapers of the time presented this extraordinary picture of people lowering their chairs and bits of furniture out windows and punting them away because they didn't want to lose them to the bailiff because Miss McCormick couldn't pay her lease. It kicked on through the 1930s, still as the Hotel Braeburn, bit of a fluctuating story through to the 1970s, when it was really low rent accommodation, despite the fact that it was on the foreshore, multi-million-dollar views these days, and was refurbished finally in the late 1980s or into the 1990s. So again, luxurious, not all that well refurbished. I think some of the bay windows that were put in aren't entirely suitable, but you can understand that typically you're having timber windows on the foreshore. But there it is, still with its grand stone foundation. And this one is the Venetian that I showed you a colour photograph of. That's the Brooklyn, so named for obvious reasons, because New York was the quintessential centre of flat living. And this one here, taking its cue from London, called the Regent. Now, all of those are still there. So I encourage you to walk along Waruda Street in Kirribilli and enjoy those. And there's, just to orientate you, there's Admiralty House up here in the gardens. Now, Kirribilli is a really great place to appreciate flat development. And there's one that was built 1939, probably begun, completed in 1940. So just as restrictions on materials were starting to bite with the onset of the Second World War, and had this not been built in 1939 or 40, it probably would never have been built, because look at the number of bricks that were used and the beautiful detailing in there, all that coloured glass for the stairwell is really lovely. So that wouldn't have happened just a couple of years later. This is very typical of Kirribilli and possibly a few areas in Milson's Point, but not many other places in North Sydney, at least, where there's the use of brick to create this lovely patterning, but also to create these vertical elements which are typical of Art Deco. So it's regarded, it's called by architectural historians Art Deco styling, Art Deco apartments, and is heritage listed locally anyway for that reason. There is one next to this which has lost all its timber windows, unfortunately. It's got aluminium windows. So when you go and look at that in Waruda Street and Kirribilli Avenue, you'll get to compare the two, both lovely buildings, but the difference that retaining timber windows makes for the appearance of a building. Unfortunately, I don't know the architect of this. I'm not even sure if we have the architectural plans in the collection. Most have survived, but some haven't. But that's an ongoing quest. Now, so the Beulah Flats was very much middle and upper middle class flat development. I found a series of photographs of Alfred Street flats, which are wonderful because they show very modest flats in that very early first 10 years of flat development in Sydney. These photographs were taken because these buildings, even though they were barely 10 years old, were about to be demolished to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And all the buildings that were demolished were documented by the government photographer. And so as a result, we've got this pretty brilliant record of early flat blocks. I have 5 dwellings for this one. You can see that the side windows, so these would have been really well lit and airy. One of the criticisms of flats, as I mentioned, was that they were too dark. There wasn't enough access to sunshine and light. Bad for kids because there's no access to gardens. Well, there's no garden there. There's a bit of a backyard, probably, yeah, not planted out. You've got these odd timber balconies here. You don't see blocks of flats like that surviving. That's a very unusual one, called Wiltuna. And focus on this one. So very early, 1913. That's the one next door, which was unnamed, oddly enough. Possibly if it was named, the names would go up in the top, the parapet. This is pressed metal, made to look like shingles, made to look like timber shingles with the bay roofs, bay windows rather. And this would all be coloured glass. You can see that they're maximizing light here. This was a symmetrical front. So if I move back, you can see those windows there on the left and matching windows here on the right. And there's only 2 dwellings there. So 1 floor and another floor, and then shops on the bottom, much as many blocks of flats have these days. There'll be some type of commercial operation going on at ground floor. So 1915, thereabouts. I've got square brackets around that because I couldn't quite nail that date. And these ones are next door again. And this is Wonderland Flats. Now, this essentially is a set of terraces, but they're called flats, which I find really interesting. 4 flats, 4 terraces. How about that? So the word flats has caught on as a way of distinguishing your building. And we know it's 1920 because it's there on the cartouche at the top. Wonderland, odd as that might sound, I suspect is a corruption of Gondwana land. Theories of continental drift and the origins of Australia as a continent, believe it or not, were being discussed in the papers of the day. And there was a sense that somehow Australia had been connected to Gondwana, which is part of India. They were on the right track, but they were not quite onto the correct theories of continental drift. It was on, they were talking about the subsidence of great land masses at the time. So it's a really interesting name for a block of flats anyway. I'm sure that's what it's referring to. Now, moving on to the Huntington, a beautiful area. I should have put this one first. Holbrook Estate down at Kirribilli again, right down on the foreshore, Carabella Street, and this is now Holbrook Avenue. And there was a great big sandstone house there, built in the possibly late 1860s, 1870s. And as is the story of Sydney, large blocks, large gardens being subdivided with each generational change. So every 20 years or so, an estate will be cut up and someone will be making money from the subdivided blocks. And that's certainly what happened with Holbrook House. And unfortunately, Holbrook House itself was demolished. There was an attempt to sell it as a property, but once it lost its foreshore, I guess people weren't interested. So all of these blocks, including lot 7 there, 1, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 at least, possibly 12, were turned into blocks of flats. And the Huntington was one of them. And there they are, occupying all that foreshore, which was once just a big garden for Holbrook House. Sorry, I'll get back to the Huntington in a sec. I got those out of order. This is the Walder, which is still there, and there's the family called the Walders who built that, and it was opened on Armistice Day in November 1911. And there are the beautiful tiling that still exists there, and the entrance to the Walder with a original sign saying no hawkers allowed. So you're not allowed to take your fresh fruit and vegetable or whatever it is you might have sold to the woman of the house in a terrace house at the time. Here's the detail of the Mayfair, which is another one of those blocks down there. And there's the entrance hall of the Mayfair. I was lucky the front door wasn't locked. I went in there and took a photograph. I didn't go any further, I hasten to add. And there are the original post boxes on the Mayfair. And there's the front of the Huntington. Sorry, I got those photographs a little bit out of order. These are really grand, imposing blocks of flats, very expensive to build, and at least 10, maybe more flats within each, units within each. That's the tiling I showed you earlier. These grey tiles with that sort of Art Nouveau, arts and crafts detailing in there. Now, this is interesting on the Huntington too. I don't know whether this is a place to pin your calling card. I can't think of anything else for it, but there's clearly one for each unit, 10 units in the block. I couldn't see a post box there, so yeah, I'm not quite sure what this was used for. And you can see a less than sensitive addition here with some type of electrical power box, you know, which has just, yeah, not really respected the beautiful timber work on the original. You would have thought there was somewhere else to stick that, but anyway. And there's one of the ones that was in lot 1 on that Holbrook estate, Mount Warwick, which is still there. Only 4 units in there, so they're probably quite large. This, I mentioned half timbering earlier, so this is very baronial, very English. You've got that half timbering there, and it's over here as well. Now, this is the architectural plan I used on the for the title of the talk, and it's an interesting one. East Crescent Street is another hotspot for flat development over at McMahon's Point. This block was not approved for some reason. You've written on somewhere here, says not approved. Not entirely sure why, because it looks like many other blocks of flats and someone's put a lot of care into the drawing, so it's not like there's not enough information. I found this interesting when I was looking more closely at the flats, because up here, this, what you might take to be a regular chimney, because it might have been from a wood stove, is in fact for a kernerator, which is a waste an internal incinerator, waste incinerator within, generally situated in the basement of a building. There may not have been a basement here, so there may have been one indeed in each of the blocks of flats, which at the time, which is this, you literally just put all your rubbish and it gets burned, and all the smoke and the ash goes up the top, and you can forget about it, whatever it might be. So in the days before we really were concerned about air pollution. And yeah, so it's an American invention and clearly used in Australian flats. Close by, these ones were built. So East Crescent Street, here's Brundar Hall. It's such a, this is a vaguely classical styling. You've got some Tuscan columns there, a bit of a parapet, classical parapet there, still standing, I think, at 29 East Crescent. This photograph, 1981, dates it to the first heritage review of North Sydney, which was completed in 1981. And North Sydney was the first council in New South Wales, at least, to commission a heritage review, and great attention was paid to these beautiful blocks of flats. And there is another one. This definitely is still standing, and it's one of my favourite blocks of flats in North Sydney, designed by an architect called E.R. Orchard, who did a lot of work in North Sydney. I don't know whether we have the plans for this, but when you stand on East Crescent Street and look up at this coloured glass window, you will see the name Casner, which you might wonder, well, that's a strange name for a building, but spelt backwards is Anzac. And you should often, if you see a strange building name, see if it makes any sense backwards. I showed you Cot Cedar earlier. Well, if you spell that backwards, it becomes Radstock, which is the surname of one of the people who had an interest in the building when it was built. So there's Anzac, built in 1917, 18, obviously at the end of the First World War. It is a really lovely block of flats built entirely in the arts and crafts styling. So there's stone, brick, rough cast, stucco up here, and the timber shingles. So really, it's completely out of the English Revival playbook, but with a modern style of building, the block of flats. Still surviving and a heritage item. Now, Flats were a new way of living, and in the case of Kasna, you're using English revival styles. Well, sometimes it can suggest sort of a glamorous American style of living, and Balerian Court is a good example of that. Not the only example in North Sydney of Spanish mission, which is very Californian at the time, detailing there. So you can see the twirly columns, the very Spanish tiles, all of which are original. This is a really big block of flats which backs onto Watt Park in Wairira Street, still there and really worth going to have a look at. Interesting also, you can just see the plain brick on the side, so no one's meant to see that, but you can see all the Spanish style stucco on the front, could do with the clean. And here is one of the most extraordinary blocks of flats in North Sydney, for that strange styling, exotic. The only way to describe this is exotic. I'm not quite sure what it's drawing on. I mean, these are vaguely classical, but that's still here. Casa Madrona is still there in Carrabba Road. Sorry, I've shown you this. Well, no, it's a good photograph to show you, in fact, because it would have been taken not long after it was built. I suspect this photograph dates the 1930s, but as close as I can get is 28, 29, and we don't have a set of plans for this either. A little hard for various reasons to nail an architect and an exact build time for that. But this would have been very glamorous and very exotic. And something to note are the original car spaces, the garages under here. Not one for every unit, but there are at least 3 there. And this is original. You can tell original car spaces because they're generally quite narrow. And you wonder how anyone fits a modern car in. You know, it's certainly not a SUV, which is commonplace in North Sydney these days. So as I said, estates are divided up, and through the early 20th century into the 1930s, those subdivisions may in fact be bought up in total and turned into just 1 or 2 blocks of flats. And that's the case with the Caro estate. Miller Street, Blue Street, to orientate you, here's Shaw School on the left, and up for sale in 1937, and that's what was built. One of 2 blocks of flats. There's another one further up William Street there, and this is the one that caught my eye back in whenever it was, 2015, when I first really began to notice it. Beautiful streamline. The technical term for this is functionalism. Most people just look at that and think, well, it's Art Deco, and it kind of is. And what's significant about this is J. E. and E. R. Justelius, who were the architects for Tooths, the beautiful streamlined pubs that still survive in many Sydney suburbs. And in fact, there's one on Blues Point Road. The Blues Point Hotel was one of their creations. So they design flats as well. The laundry wall on the top, I was lucky enough to get on top there and look at the laundry. And 1939, and it was just demolished a couple of years ago to build another very much larger block of flats. So that's a real shame. These flats are being replaced more and more by modern flats. And a lot of them aren't heritage listed. These ones certainly weren't, so it was just easy for the developer. Just 5 years ago, whatever, they bought the lot to go ahead and put in a building application, and there was no protection for it. So early 20th century flats are very vulnerable at the moment. Worth noting. And there's the plans that still survive in the collection, so we know what the interiors look like. When I heard it was being demolished, approached the developer, and we've saved some of the tiles from the various bathrooms, other elements, the laundry tubs from the roof, and the name Conway Court survived. That's in the collection. This stairwell with glass wasn't completed. I'm pretty sure there wasn't a glass stairwell there. You can see the curves. And in fact, this suggests that it's done in a stucco, whereas you could see from the photograph it was just done in a brick, finished in a brick. These ones are just extraordinary. Eric Olson worked for E.K. White, who was a very wealthy timber merchant who also made a lot of money in horse racing. He owned several racehorses and won a huge amount in the late 1920s. And he basically bought up the whole of Carrabba Point. And instead of building large mansions, which you would make sense on a promontory on the harbour in the eastern end of the harbour, he turned it into almost like a mini Manhattan. And he sandwiched these very tall, narrow apartment blocks there. Most of them designed, as I said, by Eric Olson. We have the plan still in the collection. This one is not coloured because it's a microfilmed copy of a coloured plan. And several of these still survive at the bottom of Carrabba Point. If you want to go and look at this, the taller ones are sandwiched on very small lots right down near the water. But these two are unprotected. That area falls outside the Carrabba Point Heritage Conservation Area. And one of Olson's blocks of flats was demolished 3 years ago, I think. So there's one of the set is gone, unfortunately, but together they're just such an interesting development. I suspect E.K. White wasn't so interested in urban planning and pioneering that. He was just trying to get a return on his money by putting as many people on each lot as possible. But it's the result is a fascinating, it's essentially high-rise development on a promontory on the east, which is very unusual because most of the other blocks of flats were built in directly across from Circular Quay for the reasons that I outlined earlier, that people wanted to get to and from very easily using ferries to and from the city, whereas it takes longer to get to Carrabba Point. It's the obvious place for mansions, and there were some mansions right down on the foreshore, including one built for E.K. White and designed by Eric Olson in a like a Spanish mission style, but all behind were these high rises. So very unusual area for very tall buildings. The other odd place for flats is further north around Camaret, which was the last part of the municipality to be developed because it's away from the foreshores. Had been dairy paddocks right into the 20th century. And here's a block of flats. I dated this. I think I found the original plans too, though not with the architect on there or builder, built in 1948. So you wonder why there was a need for medium density that far back, but clearly there was. Maybe it's simply economic and maximizing your return on your land. But it's when it's built, it's still near a dairy. There we are in 1958. Now the other way flats are built is with the conversion of houses, and this became increasingly common through the 1920s and 30s as the population is still increasing dramatically in North Sydney, and also with the onset of the Depression. It becomes very popular in the 1930s. If you own a big house and you fall on hard times, one thing to do is turn your house into a block of flats essentially, and if it's 2-story, maybe there's a flat on the ground floor and one on the top floor, or maybe you add a little bit to it. But we have many architectural plans in the collection that show the conversions of existing residences into blocks of flats through the 20s and 30s. This is one of the later ones, 1949, for a Dr. Rogers. I don't know whether Dr. Rogers continued to live there or if he ever lived there, if it was just an investment property, but very typical in Wickham Road, Neutral Bay, very salubrious area in the late 19th through the early 20th century, large houses predominantly, but increasingly through the post-war period, either these large houses are divided up into blocks of flats or they're demolished altogether to build those medium and high density flats which characterize the area to this day. One of the upsides of these conversions is that they have given us an architectural record of the earlier houses, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, the architectural plans pre-1929 tend not to survive in the collection. But when the house is being altered to turn into a block of flats, the architect will redraw the house in the 1930s. And as a result, we might have a plan for the house, and that's the case with this one. That house, by the way, doesn't exist anymore. It was replaced, what I've estimated to be barely 10 years later, with a very standard looking late 1950s, early 60s block of flats. So Dr. Rogers spent a lot of money turning that house into 2 flats at least, and then then selling the whole lot off. Now, Kirribilli is still there at Middlemiss Street, corner of Middlemiss and Lavender Street, and I think it's North Sydney's first housing commission flats. 3 stories. These are walk-ups. So there's no lift in here. You just walk up 2 flights of stairs to get to the top. This one, significant, A, because it's the first public housing, post-war public housing in North Sydney, contested by North Sydney Council. They didn't want this built. I don't think there was a sociological reason for that. They didn't want housing commission people in the area by any means, but they weren't allowed to dictate what was built when and where when the state government stepped in. There was a terrible housing shortage after the Second World War, just as there is now. And so there was a real move to build public housing, not so much nowadays, but certainly then after the war. And as a result, the state government pushed local interests aside to some extent, or the council would argue that, and said, well, we will put a block of housing commission flats here and there and there, regardless of what you want. And here's the first of them. Interesting because it's designed by a very renowned company of architects, Fowle, Mansfield and McClurkin, who were the architects for St Mary's Church, the 1938 church, which exists on Miller Street to this day. Now, there's the name of Clive Evatt, who was the Minister for Housing, son of Herbert Evatt, who had deep roots in the North Sydney area. The Evatts had lived at Milson's Point for generations before this, so he knew the area well. So I find it very interesting that he's there unveiling the foundation stone for that. And discovered in the library another foundation stone, which I'm planning to put on display finally, because it's extremely heavy and it kind of just gets in the way, but we've looked after it. And now I have a place for it. And here's Clive Evatt's name again. And this was for a block of flats in Mount Street. I don't yet have the address in Mount Street, which there was a whole controversy around in 1952, which I won't go into too much detail now, but Geraghty was a independent Labor member, so he was reviled by the Labor Party because he had stepped outside the party, and Evatt, but he was a very well respected local member, and Evatt wanted to name this block of flats after him, and the Labor Party said, no way, you can't honour him in that way. And Geraghty didn't particularly want the flats named after him either. He suggested Henry Lawson as a name for it, but it was called Geraghty Court, and it only survived barely 10 years before it was demolished to build the expressway. And we've got the foundation stone, and there is a photograph of Clive Evatt on the right and Mrs. Geraghty in the middle. Sorry, it's a bit blurry. It's just a very poor copy of a print from a negative. I intend to get the negative from the State Archives. Sorry, a good quality print from the State Archives. So those built in the early 50s, and here is the biggest housing commission development by considerable measure in the post-war years. Between 1948 and 1954, the Housing Commission of New South Wales builds the biggest block of flats in the Southern Hemisphere in Milson's Point, and that's Greenway. And anyone who goes to and fro across the bridge will see Greenway on the east side as you're heading south. and it's still there. And look at the size of it. Look how it towers over it. This was about 150 feet high, which was the maximum building height set for Sydney and North Sydney. That was set in 1912 and was only overturned in 1957. So that went all the way up there. Now there are 10 floors, but essentially 12 stories if you include basement and ground floor in Greenway, and 309 units. So that went a long way to alleviating that that housing shortage, I can tell you. And there's the architect, not a government architect, but Percy Gordon of Morrow and Gordon. D.T. Morrow had left the practice by then, he'd retired. So it was really just Percy Gordon who was running the show and was the prime architect for that, and must have been inspired. He went to the States and must have been inspired by Stuyvesant Town Apartments on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Still there again, but you can see the similarity. And that's a view from Greenway. You can see how much higher it is from a standard walk up. This is McDougall Street. And here's a floor plan. So there are 11 units on one floor. And I did an oral history with a woman who grew up in Greenway as a child in the late 50s or early 60s. And she referred to her floor as essentially like a neighborhood street. She knew all her neighbors and they looked after you. So each floor was, had a neighborhood quality about it. And I found that very interesting. These are 2-bedroom apartments. I don't think there are any 3-bedroom. Maybe there were 1 or 2 3-bedroom. Roy Sullivan here. I think that's Roy Sullivan there, actually. He must have taken over the finessing of the building in its last stages. And that's what an apartment looked like in 1954. People entered a lottery to see what housing commission house they might have, and there was far less what's the word, opprobrium attached to living in housing commission houses in the 1950s and 60s. Renting was far more common than it would become. So you weren't looked down upon necessarily, is the point I'm making. And there's one of the electric washers. There were 309 electric washers, 309 stoves, and therefore Greenway had to have its own electrical substation underneath it. That's how much power it used. Now, moving on and towards the end of the talk. So when you lived in a block of flats up until the late 40s, you rented your flat unless you were the very wealthy person who owned the whole block of flats, or unless you leased it from the housing commission or the housing commission. Now, in the 1940s, there was a different arrangement established where you could become part of a cooperative. You bought the whole building and therefore you owned your flat within that. This is pre-strata title. Strata title comes in the early 60s. So in order to accommodate that, several blocks of flats were built in North Sydney, and several of them were designed by a chap called Aaron Bowlett, Bolo, who was I think he came from Hungary or Czechoslovakia in the early part of the century, practiced through the 1930s, and was in demand in the post-war period. There he is there, A.M. Bolo. And this is his very modernist block of units in Wild Street, Potts Point. And this is the one for families. This was essentially for childless couples. This one for families at McMahon's Point. 3-bedroom apartments here and a swimming pool at the back, all of which is still there. So the company was called the Urban Cooperative Multi-Home Units Limited, number 2. And there were more than one of them in North Sydney, some in Kirribilli too. And so you could own your own apartment for the first time by being part of the cooperative. And that changed, as I said, with strata title in the 1960s. And one of the first buildings, if not the first, to have strata title was Blues Point Tower. And there's the building we've just been looking at. So I think it's 5 stories. And there's Blues Point Tower, which is 25 stories. So this is completed in 1962. This one was designed in 47 and completed in 1948. So there is a difference in just 20 years or less than 20 years between what is being built. And the threshold is 1957, where the limit goes from 150 feet, and Greenway tops that. The limit in 1957, I need to think, goes to around 300 feet, I think it is. And Blues Point Tower is 272 feet, so it's getting near the top of the maximum height. Yeah, now some of that, well, most of that is because of the rising of the ceiling limit in Sydney. This is a brick building, so brick load-bearing walls, as is Aaron Bollott's building here, but there's steel frames used, and curtain, increasingly what's called curtain wall, which is a glass wall, and making extra use of the structural load-bearing capacity of a steel frame. So that's where you have your glass-fronted Kirribilli waterfront apartments appearing in the late 50s and early 60s, and that pretty well takes us up to 1958 or close enough to it. And I think that's the last picture. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that, and there may be time for a couple of questions. Where are we? 4 o'clock. Okay. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Ian. I'm sure everyone would like to join me in thanking you for that. That was fantastic. There are already a few questions, comments, and so on in the chat, so I'll just read these out. So first of all, David Whitehouse said, in New York City, it was standard practice in the early 1900s to lay concrete slabs between floors and apartment blocks as they built them for acoustic purposes. Unfortunately, this does seem to have been the practice here for most Art Deco blocks. Pity about noise transfer when carpet is lifted for the aesthetic effect of bare floorboards.
Yeah, okay. You said that doesn't seem to be the case in Australia. Was that right? Was that David's comment?
That does seem, but I assume.
Yeah. And that I'm not entirely sure, but that rings true for me. Yeah. So apartments tend to be a little noisier here.
Now, I don't know if you can flick back to this particular photograph of yours. Leonard Vogel said, what is the name of the bluish tile styling within the Mayfair?
Oh, go back to the Mayfair. I'm sorry, I didn't include the photograph of the Mayfair, which I took and for some reason didn't upload. I'm really sorry about that. Now, the question was, what's the name of the
bluish tile styling?
I don't know. Yep, I honestly don't know. We're getting close. There, that mottled styling. With the coursing through it, I don't know whether it's neoclassical or not, sort of interwar classical or arts and crafts, which are the two styles primarily. Yeah, I don't know how to describe that. I'm sorry, I can't answer that properly. You can go down to Holbrook Avenue and look at the tiles very easily on the Mayfair and also on the Walder. They're very accessible.
Yes, very beautiful. I agree. Our colleague Andrew Beveridge just said, Justelius and Frederick also designed the Kirribilli Hotel and Blues Point Hotel, as well as the now demolished Rest Hotel on Alfred Street, Milsons Point, and the Victoria Cross Hotel on Miller Street, North Sydney. Yeah,
thank you, Andrew. Yes, I mentioned the Blues Point Hotel, which is still there, and the Kirribilli Hotel, which is there, but in a slightly different styling. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and so we've lost another Justelius building, which is a real shame. If people have a favourite block of flats or they're concerned about flats, you simply write to council and let them know, because it's residents and voters who make a difference when things are added to the local environment plan, where the heritage items are listed. They're the best ones to initiate change. If there's something that's concerning you, let council know.
And Andrew also says, relative to Clive Evatt, that he also opened the Greenway Flats as housing minister.
Oh, he did. Sorry, I thought I'd mention that, Andrew. Thank you so much. I meant to mention it, but obviously didn't. Yes, no. So Clive was very active on the north side and very active in his neck of the woods, all around Milsons Point. And in fact, Greenway, thank you for mentioning that. Greenway was built on the site of the family house, of Evatt's family house. It wasn't demolished to build Greenway. It was demolished. That house was demolished along with many others to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But that triangle of land down near Grantham Street, which no longer exists, but is near McDougall, remained vacant after the war. So the Housing Commission saw this triangle of land and thought, that's ideal. We need to build these blocks of flats. That's where we'll build the biggest block of flats in the Southern Hemisphere. So Clive Evatt knew that area intimately. Absolutely.
Andrew also helpfully says, in response to Leonard's question, that they look like Wunderlich tiles made in Redfern.
The blue ones?
Yes.
Oh my heaven! Well, that wouldn't surprise me, but yeah, I wouldn't venture to give a call on that, but that would be entirely possible. Thank you, Andrew. Yep.
And Marianne Simpson also said, Evatt also turned the first sod for 30 to 40 Blues Point Road.
Thank you.
And she also says 29 East Crescent Street renovation in 2000 revealed more Art Deco features.
Right. And what was in Blues Point Road, I wonder? Why was Evatt turning the sod there? It must have been another Housing Commission block of flats. Huh. I'm not familiar with that one.
There was a hotel there.
Oh, really? And Evatt turned the sod of a hotel?
The Fig Tree Inn was there for a very long time.
Right.
You know, Henry Lawson wrote a poem about that inn. And then when that was pulled down, 30 to 40 was built.
Oh, okay. Right. Thank you. I didn't know that. Thanks, Marianne.
Marianne also asked, how common was it to include sleep out verandas that I think were mentioned in the Venetian?
Yes, well, it's interesting to see it actually specified in the advertisement for Venetians, for the Venetian, sorry. So clearly it was a common thing, and I knew that already. There was a great emphasis on fresh air and sleeping, and I think it was not uncommon through the 1920s to build a balcony or veranda that could be enclosed and used for that purpose. Yeah, I think I've come across one in Shell Cove Road as well, possibly even a Waterhouse design block of flats with sleep out verandas.
Oh, Andrew's just asked, do we know about when the earliest elevators were added in North Sydney?
No, I don't have a first elevator. Sorry, Andrew. And the obvious place for an elevator would be Beulah Flats. Now, I don't have a lot of detail about that building. Because it's built in 1906, it predates our building application collection. And so it's something I need to chase up, but it's such a large building. You would think it must have had a block of, it must have had an elevator. Greenway certainly did. It had 2 elevators and still does in each of the 4 buildings. Sorry, someone was saying.
Could I say about the Beulah Flats? You know, it was built by Mrs. Havilah White.
I do.
Did you know that?
Yeah,
yes. And there was a big article up in Pipwater News all about her and her history and how she also owned Scotland Island. Yeah. And later went on to marry very prestigiously after Mr. White died. And she's a very, very interesting person.
Yeah,
the article actually said that she was a whiz on the stock exchange. This is in the 1910 to 1920.
Right.
And it said that she sort of bankrolled one of the South American countries, which was on the verge of collapsing.
Oh, crumbs.
I'll see if I can forward the article to you.
I'd love to see that. Thank you. And maybe that mentions whether it had elevators. It must have had elevators. It's so it's so big. Thank you.
Well, no more questions, I don't think.
Okay.
Our former colleague Martin just said, thank you very much for the talk. Very informative, original, few laughs too, he says. Thanks, Martin.
Oh, good. Thank you, Martin. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, this will be posted up and will be there forever, theoretically, on the internet, if you want to chase it up. And you're very welcome to come into the Heritage Centre and do research work on any of the buildings that might be featured in our various databases. We've got a database of the architectural plans, not terribly well scanned there, unfortunately, but we can always make those available for you. They're well looked after in our archive store. Yeah, so if you're interested in doing more work on buildings in the local area, we've got a very good collection to help you do that.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. If there's no
thank
more
you.
questions, we'll sign off.
Thank you.
And the next talk, I think, will be on the North Sydney waterfront. I gave a talk with Rundi Svensson last month, and we didn't have a live to the internet talk as a result of that. That was an in-library one, face-to-face. So I'll do a version of that and post that for around about this time next month, and that'll be our last talk of 2022.
Yes, that'll be Wednesday, the 30th of November.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Yep. Okay. Thanks, everyone.